Hello and welcome to India's World. The devastating armed attacks by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, have resulted in their occupying a string of cities in north of Baghdad. Because of their push to capture territory, Iraq's fate hangs in balance. There is a grave danger of Iraq heading towards a sectarian breakdown. The questions we are asking today are, can Iraq survive as a nation state? What will be the consequences of a prolonged sectarian civil war in Iraq for the region? And what can the international community do to defuse the civil war in Iraq? I'll be putting these questions to a very distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Arundhati Ghose. She was India's ambassador to Korea, to Egypt. She was also ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, knows the region very well. We have Ambassador Singh. He was India's ambassador to UAE, United Arab Emirates, and to Iran. He's a well-known commentator on foreign policy and security affairs. And we have with us my friend Dr. C. Mohan. He's one of our foremost foreign policy analysts and commentators, and currently a distinguished fellow with the Observer Research Foundation, a think tank in New Delhi. So I welcome all of you to this discussion. Ambassador Ghose, let me begin with you. If the differences between the Shias and the Sunnis continue to widen in Iraq, and with the Kurds in the northeast harboring ambitions of independence, how can Iraq survive as a nation state?
I can't see into the future, but at the moment, the ISIS has occupied only the Sunni majority cities. They have not even tried to look at the ones where there's a Shia majority. Whether it's completely up to the government in Iraq, their army, to be able to handle this. If they can't, if they do what they did in the earlier part of the uprising, because they seem to be demoralized till Sistani spoke to the Shias, then it becomes clearly Shia and Sunni. I mean, this is, you've got cities with Shia majority, you've got cities with Sunni majority. So already, but they're politically not necessarily all with ISIS. Some are just ex-Baathists, etc. So we have to see how this Iraqi government deals with it. But the danger of this going apart, just I'm going to quote their laughter by saying that the Kurds, the Peshmerga at the moment are going with the government.
Okay, we will discuss the Kurds separately. Ambassador Singh, do you think without outside intervention and help, Iraq can survive as a nation state? And do you see such help coming unequivocally pretty soon?
You see, to understand this, you have to go back to 2005-06. This is not the first time it's happened. The Sunni revolt started with Zarqawi back in 2005 and 6 when the Americans were really hanging by a very thin thread. Nobody gave them a chance. Everybody thought that they're going to quit and go, this is their Vietnam. That's where General Petraeus came in and started his what he called counterinsurgency. And they managed to win back the Sunni heartland bit by bit, talking to the Sunni leaders, the tribal leaders, and they brought them back into the mainstream. And they left it more or less fixed with its instabilities, with autonomous region for the Kurds, but the Sunnis and the Shias were supposed to work together in the government. And that has not happened because what is, particularly with the crisis then shifting to Syria, I think the same thing, they managed to get rid of this thing from here, but it migrated to Syria, and the Shia supported, because Alawites are a Shia sect. So the clash in Syria is where Iranian and the Iraqi help, because the Iraqis allowed the Iranians to use their airspace to send material across. So it brewed there. And that is where Saudis and the Qataris got sucked in, because they started giving all kinds of help. President Obama's mistake was that he drew the red lines there and then did not do anything. So they did not do anything in Syria. That brewed there, and everybody took their eye off the ball, and they thought Assad has stabilized it, we'll see how to sort out Syria, but that has now come back. And the Sunnis who had been alienated in the meanwhile by the Prime Minister and the government of Iraq.
You're not telling me what kind of outside intervention is needed just now. Yeah. So may I take that question to Raj? What kind of intervention is needed now?
If I may just complete. Yeah. Therefore, if you could stabilize it then, the only way to stabilize is to bring the Sunnis back in and isolate the ISIS. Can they do it? The question should be, which is what President Obama's lecture or his press conference was about. He said two things. we are not sending troops in. We will send advisors in. Secondly, we don't want Iran to come in because they realize if Iran sends troops, IRGC or besiege, then the Sunnis are lost. Then the country is trifurcated.
Okay. Although Iran has already sent two
Soleimani and all they're talking of,
Raj, if there is no outside intervention, coordinated outside intervention, do you see the ISIS using the territory it occupies in Syria and now in Iraq, not only to fight Damascus and Baghdad, but also others in the region?
I think two, three things. I think one, you talked about across the border, like the Syria-Iraq border has disappeared. People are coining this new phrase, much like AFPAC, what's happened with the Pashtuns here. There's something called Syrak now, which is the Sunnis who are across the Syria-Iraq border, where they're operating in both places. I mean, I think so in a sense, that border has disappeared, and I think reconstituting it will be difficult. Because as Ambassador Ghose said, and as Ambassador K.C. Singh also pointed out, the Sunni militancy can come this far, but they can't hold the Shia territories. So there is a...
But they can hold the Sunni territory.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, the question of external intervention, look, on the one hand, you have Baghdad asking for the American help. I'm sure they're already taking Iranian help to the extent that they can. But the problem is, moment America or Iran intervenes and the intervention is seen on behalf of the Shias, the Gulfos, the Saudis, a whole range of Sunni kingdoms, so they're going to say, look, this is against their interests. So the intervention will breed counter-intervention. So the question, I think, is how do you produce the internal reconciliation in Iraq and back it by an external support? But right now, neither condition is holding.
Okay. Ambassador Ghosh, do you visualize a scenario where the only effective intervention on the ground is actually by Iran? Iran has already sent 2 battalions of the Revolutionary Guard.
They're denying it, actually.
Well,
I've seen the Iranian
but they're willing to send, they're willing to fight.
Willing to. Yeah.
Now, do you visualize that they send troops there and eventually save the situation for Prime Minister Al-Maliki and Iraq becomes a client state, a Shia dictatorship, a client state of Iran?
Let me preface this by saying one thing, is that reconciliation is a lovely word. We've seen what's happened in Afghanistan with reconciliation.
I'm not talking about reconciliation at all.
No. What is being suggested that Maliki or the Iraqi government do. Who are the Sunni leaders? Because it's not purely Sunni Shia. It is also Baathist government. I mean,
remnants of it.
Remnants of, they are people who are not necessarily extremist Sunnis, but they have made common cause. Who do you speak to when you are going to try and evolve, as Obama has said? He's called for this press conference. He's called for a regional conference on the situation. Who would represent the ISIS? So you've got a problem, but I think it is moving towards a standoff between Iran and the US. Whether this will affect not the cooperation, people have been talking about cooperation between Iran and US, provided they follow certain parameters, because the US is not going to permit Iraq to become a purely Shia state because of Saudi Arabia and all the other problems, Israel,
all right.
things like that.
We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing what the future holds for Iraq, or what it might hold for Iraq. Ambassador K.C. Singh, do you think if Iraq gets partitioned, it'll split not into two countries or two regions, Shia and Sunni, but into 3, because the Kurds also want independence?
You see, this is the post-Ottoman order you have. If you realign the borders of Iraq, it will realign the borders of a number of countries around, because the ethnic groups are spilling across borders. That is why the government in Baghdad was always very keen not to let the Kurds have access to Kirkuk, because that has a huge oil field with a pipeline that goes to the Mediterranean through Turkey. Because if they get that oil field, they are then self-sufficient. But you get an independent Kurdish thing there, then the eastern part of Turkey gets threatened, and also the Kurdish area of Iran and the northeast of Syria. Similarly, the Sunnis, therefore, and the irony is that the Sunnis are a minority here, and they were being persecuted earlier by Saddam Hussein, and they were dominating the Shias here in Iraq. And in Syria,
Saddam was a Sunni himself.
No, I said, and they were, sorry, and they were dominating Iraq, whereas in Syria it's the other way around. The Shias are in a minority and dominating the government. So in effect, you're joining up the Sunnis of the two countries, the majority there and the minority here. But there is also a Sunni minority in Iran, which sits on the oil fields there. So it'll be very difficult. I think the concern of all the countries is that if you undo one, then you'll be undoing probably the entire region.
Raj, but Kirkuk has already been taken over by the Peshmerga, the Kurds. So the oil resources of Iraq, 25% are in the Kurdish region, and now they've got the oil-producing town of Kirkuk also, and the oil sharing agreement has broken down because the Kurds are selling oil directly via Turkey.
They have their own pipeline.
They have a pipeline which links to the Mediterranean pipeline, and the Turks are storing it in.
Pipeline. The Kurds have created a separate
pipeline which joins and takes it to Turkey, to Kehan. And there they have allotted separate storage for Kurdish oil, separate from Iraqi oil. Now, is it about oil alone, or do you think oil politics, oil royalties, demand for autonomy and independence, the fact that they see Iraq is breaking up, is creating an advantageous situation for the Kurds?
Look, I think the Kurds have already acquired a relative kind of an autonomy. I think what is preventing the full national liberation, shall we say, of the Kurds is because they're dispersed in more than one country. As Ambassador K.C. Singh said, look, they're in Iran, they're in Syria. So the problem is that, and Turkey, so if these guys break up in Iraq and say, look, we got a separate entity, what would be the attitude of the Turkey? Like, Turkey is fighting its own Kurdish insurgency. So unless the Turkish approach changes and say, look, we're willing to live with the Kurdish state, then other interventions will start in Kurdistan. But I think
but why are the Turks then encouraging the Kurds to sell oil directly to them? There are two tankers in the Mediterranean which have sailed from Kehan in Turkey, carrying Kurdish oil, offering it at half the international price, and America is telling the world, don't buy it.
But nothing is black or white in the Middle East, right? I mean, so what you have is, look, if it is oil, pipelines, Turkish have no problem. But if it is Kurdish independence and a Kurdish separate state, they have an issue. So I think everyone plays all sides.
The trade-off is that they are allowing them to market the oil, but they have told them not to give protection to their Kurdish separatists who go into that area. So there's been an arrangement. But the minute they start moving towards independence, it becomes a different game.
But the moment somebody starts buying Kurdish oil, you strengthen Kurdish autonomy movement.
True, but they think they can manipulate them. At the moment they think create a dependence, you can turn the tap off and obtain their cooperation.
Ambassador Ghosh, you wanted to say something?
The role of Turkey is really very important, though we in India have not been looking at Turkey as much as I think we should have, because not just the oil, but the elections are coming up in Turkey. You've got the deal that Erdogan has had with the PKK, and the fact that in the Syrian imbroglio, Assad has permitted a great deal of autonomy, as it were, to the Kurdish region. So I think that Turkey cannot take a tough stand on their oil at this stage, that, we will not buy or whatever, because the Kurds have seized an opportunity. If that reflects on Iraq, on the situation in Iraq, then I think the dangers of splitting into three. At the moment, they are with the Baghdad government, even though they've just re-emphasized their autonomy. So I think that the danger really is not so much from the Shia Sunni, which may be a standoff, but from the Kurds, who have already got their belt. So Iran would be worried, Turkey would be worried.
Okay. Ambassador K.C. Singh, since 2011, number of multinational oil companies have gone into Kurdistan, or the Kurdish autonomous region. Chevron, ExxonMobil, Hess Corporation, Total. 30 more companies have gone. And one of the companies, Genel, was trucking Kurdish oil to Turkey earlier and before they built this pipeline. So do you think these multinational corporations would want a secure sort of supply of oil from, and now Kirkuk is under them, so and if that becomes, and they have had a claim on Kirkuk as part of the autonomous region, do you think they would want this to be do you think there's any there multinational interests also involved here, or you think they will go with the flow and depending on what happens?
US at the moment doesn't need oil. That's part of the reason that they.
But rest of the world
no, in the sense that they are increasing, they are ramping up
Total
their
is
production.
French.
They're going
What
to
the
Latin
rest
America.
Of the world needs?
Rest of the world. That is long term, but you also don't want to offend other people, Saudi Arabia, etc. So US does a global calculation. It can't be just some companies benefiting from one region. But I don't think Americans will destabilize simply to get oil out of. There's much more oil in the south, in any case, than there is in Kirkuk. And this destabilizes Turkey, destabilizes a NATO ally. It creates too many things. So US is looking at major pieces when it takes a decision. It doesn't just say simply because some companies benefit from it, you do it. I don't think so.
Okay. No, the Iraqi Deputy Prime Minister has warned Turkey that's playing with fire and trading in Kurdish oil, which it is doing, seems to be doing, is really plundering Iraq's wealth. Now, do you think the Turkish government or some elements in the Turkish government and the Kurds are miscalculating the present turmoil and they think that Baghdad would not be able to tackle this and they would not be able to defend its own interests?
I think, right after the first Gulf War, that when Father Bush intervened to liberate, Kuwait from Iraq, from that time onwards, the Kurds had enjoyed a relative autonomy within the structure. So that is, they've been slowly moving towards greater freedom to use their own resources. Baghdad can say what it wants. But I think the challenge, I think, is much deeper. I think it is the question, look, if the internal structure disappears in Iraq, and if the current regime in Baghdad is incapable of maintaining a measure of unity between different groups, then I think everyone is going to intervene. Oil is only one part of it, I think. Look at southern Iraq. It's all the Chinese who got the major oil deals. So I think it's not a Western oil multinational conspiracy. In fact, the stakes are far more complicated. But
I wasn't talking about conspiracy. Interests. They have interests there.
Like Chinese,
and those interests are not limited to American interests.
Yeah, and that's what, in the north, because the Kurdish thing was separate from the beginning, the Americans had moved in much earlier.
The alliance were looking at it at one stage. I don't know whether they are still there.
But in the south, once the new regime came, and remember when people said, look, US is intervening in Iraq because of oil, but actually most of the new contracts went to the Chinese because now the Chinese are a much bigger
My question was, shouldn't the world, especially Turkey, stop dealing in Kurdish oil right away?
I think Turkey is playing a much bigger game, Bharat. I think it's not just about oil. Look, they thought they can extend their influence. They thought they could actually, they were supporting the Brotherhood in Egypt. They thought they could support a larger Sunni forces so that they could emerge as a major force. So they're playing a much bigger game. But the problem for them is the things have gone out of hand. And today they'll have to find a way of pulling back a little bit and be a little more reasonable than they've been in the last 4 or 5 years.
All right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion in a while. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing what the future holds for Iraq. Ambassador Ghose, what would need to happen if Iraq has to be reconstituted as an inclusive democracy? And can a new inclusive democracy?
Okay. What? I think we're asking for a very difficult thing. A democracy, and a democracy which is inclusive. I think this is an over-ambitious thing. But if they have a form of government which is inclusive, the chances, I think, diminish for as long as Maliki is there. Now, how do you, at this crisis point, get rid of Maliki? And there, the Iranians would have to be able to tell Maliki or find some way in which you can reduce the bitterness and the suspicion, because I don't think you can have it talk about inclusion when people are they just don't trust each other. So it's a democracy, perhaps long term. Inclusion in some form of government, whatever it is something where the countries which are stakeholders who have direct interest, including the United States, will have to play an urgent role.
Okay. Basically, Singh, do you agree that Prime Minister Nouri Al-Maliki will have to go because the Sunnis of Iraq just don't trust him? He's gone back on all the promises he made of reintegration, reconciliation, and purged them from all important state institutions.
Well, he's chased his own vice president out, registered a murder case on him, his vice president sitting in, Sunni vice president sitting in Turkey. I think you have to move on two tracks. Syria and Iraq will have to move on two parallel tracks because you can't fix one without fixing the other. Iranian influence, this is what Obama was saying, essentially they realize that Iran will play a role here, but they don't want that. Even Grand Ayatollah Sistani has said that the militia should not be revived because first he made a call for youngsters to defend, and then second day he said only through the Iranian army, only through the Iraqi army, because he corrected himself and his voice carries a lot of weight in Iraq. So even he realizes that if he revived the Muqtada al-Sadrs, incidentally he's also resurfaced in Iraq. But if you bring up those militias, then you'll go back to 2005-06.
So if you don't want the militias, you have to send ground troops because this army is essentially a Shia army.
No, I think what will happen will be basically because the command structure has broken down. There's probably nothing wrong with the army. That is where the 3,000 American officers who will go in there.
300
officers will go in there. Will even small groups attached to their division headquarters, knowing that they have trained that army with the intelligence and with some aerial support, I think they should be able to at least stabilize it. And then reach out to the Sunnis because you have to detach the Sunni heartland from ISIS. You have to isolate ISIS. Now that will be the first step. Now fixing it, if Americans could not make it an inclusive democracy with $2 trillion and more than 2,000 lives lost, who else can do it?
Raj, do you agree with the Masih Kaisi Singh that the real problem is actually in the region is Syria? Because Americans left Iraq in somewhat manageable situation. The Iraqis could have handled it. But the Syrian developments created problems. The ISIS jihadis were always there in Iraq, but they were sort of spread out. They went there, and now Iraqi Sunnis see that people are taking on Damascus. So they went there, they gained territory there, and now they have returned to claim territory in Iraq. So unless Syria is settled, as Ambassador Kaisi Singh says, you cannot settle Iraq.
I think it's all interlinked. I see the problem is I think a deeper one and a structural one. That I think for nearly 100 years, authoritarian regimes, force largely kept a very complex system in place.
It was secular.
And part of it was secular, part of it was not. But I think the challenge was this, that each of these countries had minorities. In some cases, as Ambassador Kaisi Singh pointed out, in Bahrain, there's a minority Sunni ruling over Syrian Shia majority. In Iraq, it was a Shia majority was disempowered for long. In Syria, a Shia sect was ruling over Sunni minority. But this structure was kept intact by force, by strong governments. Now, the Arab Spring, the social turbulence is breaking it down, and as a consequence now, the sectarian...
American intervention broke it down.
No, everything. It's not just American intervention. It is not as if American intervention is the only thing. The fact was, internally, it was an unstable structure.
We should not forget what came first.
No, there was American intervention, there was Russian support, there was the Ba'athists. So it is not, it is not a... I think for too long, I think we've seen this region as a single Muslim entity or a single Arab entity, and the Americans were the bad boys. Look, Americans have the biggest blame, but before that they were British. There were the Russians after that. So I think it is a much more complex game. I think what we're seeing today is a breakdown of this order where no minority rights are respected. In some cases, the majority rights are not respected. So therefore, this structure is going to be very difficult to hold it together in the present form.
You wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think in addition to these, the role of states, we need to look or also be aware of the rise of extremist, violent Islam, because the a lot of the Afghans Afghan extremists had moved to Syria. I'm not sure, I have not come across this, whether they are also participating in ISIS, because you've got these, they keep calling them foreigners, and the West is interested only in those foreigners who might go back, who are their nationals. But you have large numbers of Chechens, you have large number of Uyghurs. there is a rise of this extremist fundamentalist thing across. So it is difficult to just link it with Syria alone. Okay. I agree. I mean, you've got to settle both. But if Afghanistan collapses because there are these problems with the runoff.
The Arabs first came to Afghanistan. The Americans mobilized the Arabs to fight Afghanistan.
You will have a problem.
Let me take this question as the last question. Do you think, as Ambassador Ghose is saying, the battle for Iraq actually signals the beginning of a much bigger sectarian war for control of the Arab lands? And what are the consequences of that?
So let's first look at it from radical Islam point of view. You know, the unity which Al-Qaeda had created and the whole symbolism, myth of Osama bin Laden, the way he lived and the way he died, that's broken down. Because ISIS leadership is challenging the supremacy of Al-Qaeda. So they're literally, because Al-Qaeda was supporting a Nusra, and that's been left behind. And al-Baghdadi thinks that he is now the leader of global jihad and not Zawahiri sitting somewhere in Afpak. It's very interesting that Al-Qaeda has suddenly
impact on the region, please.
No, I'm saying has suddenly issued a statement on Kashmir. Earlier, Kashmir used to be number 2 or 3 or 4 on their list, not on top of the list. The danger to India is that if that area is lost and Al-Qaeda has diminishing influence, they may start focusing on South Asia.
Okay, one last question and quick answer. Do you think Iraq will survive this turmoil as a nation state? Yes or no?
I think short term, yes. Long term, no.
Casey?
I would agree there. Because
Ambassador Ghose?
No, I'm not going to say. I think that Iraq, there was a sense of nationalism which was built up. We are completely discounting Iraqi nationalism. Whether the Kurds get more autonomy, it's my thing is the Kurds, is another issue. But I think Iraq can get together if you...
All right. Okay. So we've run out of time. Thank you very much for taking time and coming here and analyzing this complex situation for our viewers. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week with another interesting issue. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching.